When I was a child, I had no head for math. And perhaps as a default, I came to love words. I particularly loved metaphors. When my mother told me that if I didn't turn in my math homework, my teacher was about to skin me alive, I knew exactly what she meant. And many years later, when I read Dickens, and Dickens said that old Marley was as dead as a doornail, I completely understood. Metaphors made the strange familiar. A few months ago, I ran across a study that confirmed another bias I've always had about metaphors. This was a study in a journal called Psychological Science, and the name of the paper was Bottling the Emotions Genie. And what they did is they had participants think of a painful episode in their past, write about it, and then half the group were invited to take that piece of paper, seal it in an envelope, and the other half were asked to just turn the paper back in. And it turned out those who sealed the envelope had much less emotional distress about the event than those who didn't, suggesting that the physical act of sealing the envelope, the metaphor, if you will, had also effectively sealed the genie back in the bottle. That experiment reminds me that metaphor is how we explain our past, metaphor is how we shape our present, and perhaps most importantly, metaphor, the metaphors we pick predicate our future. Now, there's one metaphor that I know you and I share, and it's the metaphor of a journey. My journey, my trajectory has brought me here, has brought you here to this wonderful event. Napoleon said many years ago that geography is destiny. And that phrase makes a great deal of sense to me, and especially in my parents' lives. My parents come from the south of India. They were both physics graduates. They were hired separately to go teach in Ethiopia. And they met there and married. And because they changed their geography, their destiny changed completely. That's a picture of them after the marriage with my mother's parents. My brother and I were born in Ethiopia, and we then moved to India and then to America. And our destinies were completely different from our parents because our geography was also quite different. Now, there's another kind of metaphorical journey that you and I engage in, which is an inner journey, and it begins in childhood. Now, middle-class Indian parents, I always think, are very much like middle-class Jewish parents, in as much as when you're a child, you get the sense that your choices in life are, you can be a doctor, a lawyer, an engineer, or a failure. These are your options. And I have an older brother who's a brilliant mathematician, and I, by contrast, had no head for any of the quantitative sciences. But I love to read, although I will confess that my reading had a certain prurient bias. I discovered Lady Chatterley's Lover when I was 9. I read Lolita when I was 10. And I picked up the novel that was to change my life, Of Human Bondage by Somerset Maugham, and I picked it up because the title held great promise. But I must tell you that the book turned out to be much better than anything I imagined. The protagonist is a young boy called Philip. You learn on page 2 that he's born with a club foot, a deformity. He's orphaned by page 3, and he has a miserable childhood where he's bullied. His only outlet is that he loves to paint. He's an artist. And he goes to Paris when he comes of age to become an artist, only to find that he doesn't quite have the talent. And so he returns to London, where there's a scholarship awaiting him, and he goes to medical school. The first 2 years are hard, but finally comes this moment, as Somerset Maugham describes it, when Philip arrives on the wards and sees patients for the first time. He sees humanity there in the rough. And he's intrigued by the variety of people that he meets. He's intrigued by how their occupations, their personalities are reflected in their speech and the way they dress, how their disease is often reflected in their gait. And he's surprised that the most personal things they're willing to tell him, despite the fact he's shy, or maybe because he's shy, he feels that they open up to him, and he feels the great privilege of being with human beings at the time of distress. And the line Somerset Maugham used was, "There was humanity there in the rough, the artist's canvas." Ladies and gentlemen, those words spoke to me. They implied to me that not everybody could be a brilliant mathematician, like my brother. Not everybody could be a brilliant artist. But anybody with a curiosity about the human condition, with a willingness to work hard, with an empathy for their fellow human being, could become a great physician. That's what I took away. And I found medicine to be very rewarding. I went into it with the sense that medicine was a romantic, passionate pursuit. I haven't stopped feeling that way. And for someone who loved words, anatomy was such fun. The prevailing metaphor in anatomy was that of a house. You know, the chambers of the heart, the fascial sheets, the endocardial cushions, the round window, the oval window, the floor of the mouth, the floor of the pelvis, the roof of the mouth, the tonsillar columns, on and on. Whereas physiology, the prevailing metaphor, was one of an industrial machine. The liver as this Detroit-like factory, and the heart as this unimaginative pump, and the lungs as an oxygenator, and the immune system as an army. And I found even more fascinating were the eponyms. To have things named after people were wonderful, great handholds to knowledge. The islets of Langerhans, the foramens of Magendie and Lushka, Hunter's canal in the groin. Hunter, by the way, fascinating character. Apart from all his great anatomical discoveries, you might not know this, but Hunter took pus from a patient with gonorrhea, and to our great benefit, he inoculated himself in his penis and made detailed observations for the next 30 days. However, tragically, unbeknownst to him, he had also inoculated himself with syphilis, and he died of a syphilitic aneurysm, which is often called Hunter's aneurysm. But I was finally ready to embark on the wards. I was ready to see humanity there in the rough. And I began my medical training in Africa, and the first disease I encountered, the first patient, had syphilis. What an amazing disease. William Osler spoke of syphilis as being the great imitator, because it could appear anywhere. And in the brain, it could look like a brain tumor, in the heart, like a heart attack. It could look like rheumatoid arthritis. William Osler said you could teach all of medicine with just this one disease. And it was so rich in metaphor and eponyms. If you look at all the things that are described within syphilis, you have the peg-shaped incisor, you have the mulberry molar, you have the saddle nose deformity, you have the saber shin tibia, you have the gun barrel site, you have Clutton's joints, Hunter's aneurysms, on and on you could go. Such a rich treasure trove of words. And I actually found that all disease was like that. In fact, once I became a writer, many, many years later, I learned that my writer friends were actually coming to our old textbooks looking for our metaphors. And just to give you a short example of fruit metaphors, if I wanted to make a partial list, we have the apple core lesion of colon cancer. We have the strawberry tongue of scarlet fever, which the next day becomes a raspberry tongue. We have the podorange, we have the currant jelly sputum of Klebsiella pneumonia. We have the podorange appearance of the breast. And I could go on, the cherry angioma, the cherry red spot, the melon seed body of tuberculosis. That's just fruits. Don't get me started on the non-vegetarian stuff. But what I also learned was that diseases themselves were metaphors. I came of age as a physician in the AIDS era, took care of hundreds of young men predominantly who died, and they didn't just die of a T-cell virus. They also died of the metaphor of HIV. They died under its shroud, and it was a metaphor of shame and secrecy. It burdened them doubly, if you will. But this is an old idea, the idea of diseases themselves being metaphors. Tuberculosis was viewed as a disease of excess passion. Keats, who died of tuberculosis, said, "If the tuberculosis doesn't kill me, the passion will." And I think we see vestiges of this in the fashion industry, where we romanticize protein, calorie, malnutrition, and wasting, and think of it as something somehow desirable. This young man I saw in 1994 when I was on assignment for the British Esquire. I saw him 4 weeks after he presented to a local hospital, a government hospital, with fever, cough, chest pain, but most alarming to him, the sudden onset of the coughing up of blood. He was a diamond cutter by trade. And when he got to the government hospital, he found that there were 20 to 30 others just like him, many of them diamond cutters. And not only that, the hospital was surrounded by armed soldiers who were not going to let any patients out of the hospital. That night, this city of 1.5 million did not sleep. Rumors abounded. And the next morning, the chief minister, unfortunately, uttered the word plague. Uttered it, I think, on the basis, many of us think on the basis of incomplete evidence. And once he said the word plague, this city of 1.5 million emptied out. It was the largest mass migration seen since partition. The borders of India were closed. The economic disruption was huge. And all because of the metaphor of what it meant to have plague, the connotations of plague, even though I think it was completely wrong. So after taking you through this grand romp through medicine and metaphor, I have a question for you. Every metaphor that I just described to you, the strawberry tongue, the saber shin tibia, the mulberry molar, anything you like to throw out, every metaphor I described is 60 to 100 years old. And yet, in my lifetime, and yours, I suspect, we've seen so many new diseases. AIDS, Lyme, Legionnaires, SARS, ehrlichiosis, Ebola, to mention just a few. We have so many wonderful new ways of imaging the body, looking inside, scanning the body, PET, MRI, so on. And yet, strangely, not one new metaphor that I can think of that's quite as powerful as the salt and pepper appearance of the skull, or the hot cross bun of the skull, or the saber shin tibia. Nothing quite like that. It's a strange gap. It's a strange paucity because we are so imaginative. The amount of science has done in the last 10 years eclipses anything that's happened in the last 100 years. So we're not lacking in imagination, but we may be lacking in metaphorical imagination, perhaps. Cynthia Ozick, speaking to the National Academy of New York Academy of Medicine, said that the function of medical metaphor is to allow those without pain to understand what it is to suffer, to allow those at the center to understand what it is like to be weak or at the periphery. Metaphor allows us to experience the other. And our lack of metaphor, this strange dearth of metaphor given the science we have, I think leads to two consequences that are palpable. One is Congress is not funding our research, is not funding the NIH in the manner it should if they understood what we were doing. And so clearly, we have a metaphorical gap there in conveying the excitement, the potential of all the great ideas you're going to hear and have heard the last few days. Similarly, patients are not as enamored with our medicine and our science as we might think they should be. In fact, I get letters from patients all across the country, and I collect them, I treasure them. And it's interesting the kind of metaphors that they use. Patients will say, he or she did not lay a hand on me. To use another metaphor, although that might be not a metaphor but a statement. He or she did not touch me. He or she had one foot in the room and one foot in the corridor while they were conveying important news. So clearly, patients have no dearth of metaphors, and they're telling us very clearly what we want. I want to wind down by reciting for you a poem by someone who paradoxically is not a poet, or wasn't thought of as a poet, but was the master of the American short story. Raymond Carver, the master of the modern minimalist American short story, was, as you can see, a smoker. He was also an alcoholic, but he got sober towards the end of his life. Married Tess Gallagher. They had a wonderful marriage, but tragically, he was found to have lung cancer. And in the last days, he wrote this series of prose poems called New Path to the Waterfall. And I want to recite one for you. It's called What the Doctor Said. What the doctor said. He said, it doesn't look good. He said, it looks bad. In fact, real bad. He said, I counted 32 of them on one lung before I stopped counting. I said, I'm glad. I wouldn't want to know about any more being there than that. He said, are you a religious man? Do you kneel down in forest groves and ask for help? When you come to a waterfall, mist blowing on your face and arms, do you stop at such moments and ask for understanding? I said, not yet, but I intend to start today. He said, I'm really sorry. He said, "I wish I had some other news to give you." I said, "Amen." And he said something else I didn't catch. And not knowing what else to do, and not wanting him to have to repeat it and me to fully digest it, I just sat there and looked at him, and he looked back. It was then I jumped up and thanked this man. It was then I jumped up and shook hands with this man who had just given me something no one else in the world had ever given me. I may have even thanked him, habit being so strong. Ladies and gentlemen, the metaphor of Raymond Carver's description teaches me much more about what it's like to receive bad news, a terminal diagnosis, than anything I've ever read in any textbook. I want to close by inviting you to create the metaphors that are befitting our wonderful era of discovery. I want to invite you to name things after yourself. Go ahead, why not? I want to invite you to share with me the metaphor that guides my life. It's the metaphor of a calling. It's the metaphor of a ministry of healing. It's the metaphor of the great privilege that we're allowed, all of us who have anything to do with healthcare, the privilege of being allowed into people's lives when they're at the most vulnerable. It's very much an art of medicine. And we have to bring all the great science, all the big data, all the wonderful things we're going to be talking about, we have to bring those to bear, one human being to another. And I want to remind you of Paracelsus' wonderful invocation to us. He asked us to love the sick, each and every one of them, as if they were our own. And you know what, ladies and gentlemen? They are our own because we are all humanity there in the rough. Thank you very much.